The wind scraped across the high desert, a constant, biting presence that offered no solace. Elara huddled deeper into the inadequate shelter of the rocky overhang, the thin shawl offering little defense against the chill that seemed to penetrate bone. Dust coated her tongue, a dry, perpetual taste of hardship and fear. She was 14, though the years spent under the prophet's watchful, demanding I felt like an eternity, stripping away childish lightness and replacing it with a brittle, weary vigilance. Her stomach ached with a familiar emptiness, a dull counterpoint to the sharp terror that had driven her from the only life she had known, however twisted. The community had been all-consuming, a world of rigid rules, unquestioning obedience, and the oppressive weight of the prophet's supposed divine will. Her parents were gone, taken by the fever years ago, leaving her a ward of the flock, a quiet, easily overlooked creature. But she had seen things, heard whispers not meant for young ears, whispers of harsh punishments, of hidden practices, of a world beyond their isolated canyon that was not the pit of sin the prophet described, but merely different. Normal. The thought had planted itself like a stubborn weed, growing in the fertile ground of her quiet desperation. Escape had been a near impossible feat, a desperate scramble in the dead of night while the others slept, fueled by a raw, unreasoning need for air that didn't feel thick with dogma. She'd run for 2 days, across unforgiving ground, under a sun that bleached the world white by day and stars that offered cold, indifferent light by night. Now exhaustion was a heavy cloak, dragging her down. She was exposed, vulnerable. She knew the search parties would be out. The prophet tolerated no straying sheep. They would see her return as a sign from their God, proof of her wickedness, and her punishment would be severe. A sound, not the wind, a deliberate step on loose stone. Elara froze, heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She pressed herself back into the shadows, barely daring to breathe, eyes wide and darting. A figure emerged from the swirling dust, tall and lean, moving with a practiced economy that spoke of familiarity with this harsh landscape. He wasn't one of the flock. They were softer, their movements hesitant outside the canyon walls they rarely left. This man wore worn leather and canvas, carried a rifle slung across his back, and his face, shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, was weathered and hard. He moved with a quiet intensity that was both unsettling and, strangely, compelling. He stopped, scanning the area with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. His gaze swept over her hiding place, lingered for a fraction of a second, then moved on. But she felt seen, exposed. He didn't call out, didn't make a move towards her. He just stood, a silent, imposing presence against the vast, indifferent sky. She remained frozen, unsure whether to bolt or stay. Her muscles screamed with fatigue. Her throat was raw. Survival instincts warred with ingrained fear. He turned his head slightly, his gaze sweeping back. This time it stopped on her. He didn't smile, didn't offer a greeting, just looked. A long, assessing look that felt less like judgment and more like appraisal. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken questions and the desolate sound of the wind. She was trapped between the wolves she knew and this unknown, solitary figure. The stakes were simple, brutal. Capture and certain doom, or trust in a stranger whose very stillness was a mystery. The desert offered no middle ground. The air was thin, cold, and heavy with the scent of dry earth and a lurking primal fear. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold. He took a step closer, his movement slow and deliberate, intended not to startle. He didn't lower his rifle, but he didn't raise it either. He just stopped a few yards away, the wind whipping at the edges of his coat. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and rough, like stones tumbling in a dry creek bed. "You're a long way from the canyon, girl." It wasn't a question. He knew where she was from. The implication hung heavy in the air. He knew of the community. Likely knew what leaving it meant. He hadn't given her up yet. That small, unexpected fact loosened something rigid inside her. Fear was still a vice around her chest, but a sliver of cautious hope, thin as a moon sliver, pricked through. She couldn't speak. her throat tight with disuse and fear. She just nodded, a small, jerky movement. His eyes, she saw now they were a pale, light color under the brim of his hat, studied her face. Not with pity, but with a kind of assessing calm. He seemed to weigh her, the dust, the situation. He glanced back the way she had come, then towards the horizon where the sun was beginning its long, slow descent, painting the sky in bruised purples and oranges. "They'll be looking," he stated. Another simple fact, devoid of emotion. She nodded again, numbly. They would hunt her like a lost lamb, or more accurately, a tainted one. The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through her, cold and sharp. He was silent for another long moment, the wind filling the space between them. He seemed to come to a decision. He gestured with his chin towards a dark shape barely visible against the rocks further away. A horse, saddled and ready. "Come on," he said. "You stay here, you won't last the night." It wasn't an offer. More of a quiet command, delivered without expectation or warmth. Just the stark reality of survival. She hesitated for only a second. The choice, if there ever was one, was stark. She pushed herself up, wincing as her stiff muscles protested. Every instinct screamed danger, screamed not to trust. But the image of the prophet's face, hard and unforgiving, was a stronger deterrent than any unknown threat this man presented. She walked towards him, each step a leap into the unknown, a desperate gamble against the coming night and the relentless pursuit she knew was inevitable. The silence of their journey was broken only by the steady beat of the horse's hooves on the rocky ground and the incessant whisper of the wind. She sat in front of him on the saddle, small and trembling, acutely aware of his presence behind her. He offered no conversation, no reassurance, just the quiet, steady control of the reins and the warmth of his body a little distance behind her. She risked a glance back once. His profile was sharp against the fading light, eyes fixed on the trail ahead. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking for something. Danger, perhaps. She didn't know his name. He hadn't asked hers. Felt fitting for this stark, transactional rescue. He had offered survival. She had accepted out of necessity. Trust was a concept as foreign to her as the world outside the canyon walls. Trust had been weaponized in the community, used to expose doubt and enforce conformity. Now she only had observation. She watched his hands on the reins, strong and competent. She felt the subtle shifts in his weight as the horse navigated uneven ground. She noted the way his eyes scanned the horizon, ceaselessly. Slowly, tentatively, the raw edge of her fear began to dull, replaced by a weary uncertainty. He smelled of leather, dust, and something clean and wild, like pine needles after rain. It was a scent utterly alien to her, different from the close, unwashed smell of the community. They rode through the night, stopping only once by a small, hidden spring. He dismounted, let the horse drink, and then offered her a battered tin cup. The water was icy and pure, tasting of minerals and freedom. She drank greedily, the first water she'd had in days that wasn't brackish or rationed. He watched her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. He didn't drink himself. He seemed perpetually watchful, a sentry in the darkness. He pulled a piece of jerky from a pouch and handed it to her. It was tough and salty, but nourishing. She ate slowly, savoring each bite. He ate nothing. He just stood, rifle held loosely in his hand, listening to the night. It was a strange, silent meal, shared under a sky crowded with stars, the vastness of which was both terrifying and awe-inspiring after the confined world of the canyon. She finished the jerky, her stomach no longer a knot of pain. She looked at him, wanting to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. "How did you thank someone for this? For seeing you, for not leaving you, for offering a scrap of life?" He seemed to sense her gaze. He met her eyes for a brief moment, then looked away, back into the darkness. "Rest now," he said. His voice still rough but with a faint undertone of something not quite kindness, but certainly not cruelty. He didn't tell her to rest, but that she should rest. She lay down near the spring, curling into a tight ball, using the thin shawl as a meager blanket. He didn't lie down. He remained standing, a dark silhouette against the lighter sky, a sentinel. She watched him until exhaustion finally pulled her under, drifting into a sleep deeper than she'd had in years, a sleep not haunted by the fear of being discovered, but merely shadowed by the unknown. He was still there when she woke at dawn, the first light painting the sky. He hadn't slept. He led them to a small, isolated cabin nestled deep in a narrow canyon, miles from any roads or settlements. It was rough-hewn and simple, built from logs and stones, blending into the landscape almost seamlessly. A wisp of smoke curled from the stone chimney. Inside it was sparse but clean. A rough table, 2 chairs, a cot, a small fireplace. It smelled of wood smoke and something herbal. He didn't explain why he lived here or how long he had. He simply moved with purpose, building up the fire, heating water. He offered her a tin plate with plain, hot porridge. It was the most nourishing thing she had eaten since she'd fled. He ate nothing again. He seemed to subsist on vigilance. As the days passed, she fell into a quiet routine dictated by his unspoken rhythm. She helped with small chores, sweeping the dirt floor, fetching water from the nearby creek, gathering dry wood. He rarely spoke, but he watched her. Not in the way the prophet had watched, seeking out sin and weakness, but with a quiet, assessing gaze that seemed to acknowledge her presence without demanding anything from her. He was a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. He left food out for her. He made sure she had a blanket at night. He fixed the leaky roof without being asked. He worked on his rifle or sharpened knives with a quiet, focused intensity. She learned to read him not by what he said, but by the set of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders, the direction of his gaze. When he was still and quiet, the danger was low. When he was restless, pacing or checking the horizon, she knew they needed to be wary. The memory of the community, the prophet's face, the rigid control, began to recede like a bad dream, though the fear of being found was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her new, tentative peace. She started to feel a sense of safety she hadn't known existed. This man, this quiet, capable stranger, was a shield. But the outside world pressed in. One afternoon he came back from hunting, his face grim. He didn't say anything at first, just cleaned his rifle with meticulous care. Later, as the sun dipped below the canyon rim, painting the sky in fiery hues, he spoke, his voice low. They were asking questions in town. He meant the nearest settlement, a 2-day ride away, little more than a trading post and a handful of sod houses. Description fits you. He didn't need to say who they were. The prophet's reach was long, his influence insidious, spreading like a blight through fear and manipulation. The locals, wary of outsiders and susceptible to the prophet's charismatic rhetoric, would be easily swayed. The consequence of his act of rescue was now becoming clear. He hadn't just taken her. He had taken on the prophet's wrath, the community's relentless pursuit, and the suspicion of anyone influenced by them. He had traded his quiet isolation for a dangerous entanglement. For her, the weight of that knowledge settled heavily on her. She was not just a refugee. She was a liability. The tension in the small cabin was palpable, a silent acknowledgement of the approaching threat. He had become more watchful, spending long hours scanning the approaches to the canyon. He taught her simple things, how to load the rifle, how to recognize the tracks of a stranger, how to move silently. He didn't talk about fighting or dying, but his actions were a preparation for both. She learned quickly, driven by a fierce, new determination. She would not be helpless. She would not be a burden. She owed him her life, and she would not be the cause of his downfall. Her fear had not vanished, but it was tempered by a steely resolve. She was no longer the cowering girl hiding under an overhang. She was a survivor, hardening in the crucible of necessity. One morning the air felt different, still heavy, charged with an unspoken energy. He was outside the cabin before dawn, rifle in hand. When she emerged, he held a finger to his lips, signaling silence. His eyes were fixed on the canyon mouth. She followed his gaze, seeing nothing at first, Then a faint shimmer in the distance, dust rising against the pale sky. Riders, several of them, coming this way, the prophet's men. Her stomach twisted, a cold knot of dread. This was it, the reckoning. They would bring her back, purified by punishment, a warning to others. And him, they would deal with him swiftly, brutally for interfering. He turned, his gaze meeting hers. For the first time, she saw something flicker in his pale eyes, not fear, but a quiet acceptance of the grim task ahead. He didn't tell her to run. He didn't tell her to hide. He just nodded towards the cabin, a silent instruction. She understood. Bar the door. Stay low. She nodded back, her own resolve hardening. She wasn't going back. Ever. She retreated inside, the heavy wooden door feeling flimsy against the coming storm. She heard his movements outside, the soft clink of metal, the rustle of brush as he positioned himself. The silence stretched, taut and nerve-wracking, punctuated only by the sound of her own breathing and the frantic beating of her heart. Then the first shouts, rough, angry voices echoing up the canyon. "Healy, we know you got the girl. Send her out, and we'll be lenient." So that was his name, Healy. His voice, when it came, was calm, steady, cutting through the aggression. "She's not going anywhere." A moment of stunned silence, then a roar of fury. "You defy the prophet. You harbor a sinner." Healy's reply was succinct, devoid of religious fervor. "She ain't yours anymore." The first shots rang out, deafening in the narrow canyon. Glass shattered from the single small window. Alara dropped to the floor, covering her head, trembling but not paralyzed by fear. She heard more shots, the sharp crack of Healy's rifle, the wilder reports of the attacker's guns. She heard shouts of pain, curses. The acrid smell of gunpowder drifted through the broken window. She crawled to the hearth, reaching for the heavy iron poker. It was a pathetic weapon against rifles, but she would not simply wait. She would fight. Time stretched agonizingly. The sounds of the fight seemed to move, ebbing and flowing. She heard footsteps outside, scrabbling on rock. A groan, a cry, then silence. A silence different from the watchful quiet of their days. This was heavy, final. Had they? Fear clawed at her again, raw and potent. Slowly, cautiously, she pushed herself up. She crept to the door, straining to hear. Nothing, just the wind and the distant call of a hawk. Hesitantly, she unbarred the door, pushing it open a crack. The scene outside was stark. 2 men lay on the ground, unmoving. Healy stood further down the canyon, his rifle still held ready, watching the retreat of the remaining attackers who were disappearing around a bend. He looked weary. His shoulder was clutched, dark blood staining his shirt. He had been hit. She gasped a small, choked sound. He turned, seeing her. His expression was grim, but there was a flicker of something else, relief perhaps, that she was unharmed. He began to walk back towards the cabin, slowly, favoring his injured side. He reached the cabin, leaning against the door frame, breathing heavily. "They ran," he said, his voice tight with pain. "Took their dead with them." He slid down the frame to sit on the ground, his hand still pressed to his shoulder. "They won't forget this," he murmured, looking out at the empty canyon. "They'll spread the word. No one will take kindly to me after this. Not hear the dire consequences." His reputation was now ruined, tied forever to a girl who had defied the prophet. His isolation, once a choice, was now a necessity, enforced by the hostility his actions had earned him. He had paid a steep price for her rescue. Alara knelt beside him, her earlier fear replaced by a fierce surge of protectiveness towards this man who had risked everything for her. He needed help. She had seen him care for himself, clean wounds with practiced efficiency. But this was different. This was her turn. Without a word, she helped him carefully remove his shirt, revealing a ragged bullet wound in his shoulder. It looked deep. Her hands trembled slightly, but her mind was clear. She remembered watching him tend to smaller cuts, how he boiled water, cleaned the wound, wrapped it. She went inside, boiled water, found clean strips of cloth. She returned and, following the quiet lessons she'd absorbed, began to clean the wound. It was gruesome, painful work, but she focused, concentrating on his quiet instructions, her touch as gentle as she could make it. He watched her, his face pale, but his eyes held that same unreadable calmness. As she worked, a profound silence settled between them, different from the earlier tense silence. It was a silence of shared experience, of mutual reliance. When she was finished, the wound cleaned and bandaged as best as she could. He leaned his head back against the doorframe, closing his eyes. He looked exhausted, vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. She sat beside him, not knowing what else to do. The world outside the canyon seemed vast and hostile. The prophet's people were enemies. Any settlement would likely shun him or worse. He had saved her life, but in doing so, he had perhaps confined himself even more completely. Yet, looking at him, she didn't feel despair. She felt resolve. He had given her a chance at life, a life free from the suffocating control of the community. He had shown her quiet strength, competence, and a form of protection she had never known. He had broken his own solitude for her, paid a cost that was both tangible and deeply isolating. But he hadn't just rescued an orphan girl. He had forged something new in the crucible of the high desert. He had taken a frightened, brittle child and, through his quiet example and the shared facing of danger, allowed a resilient young woman to emerge. She looked out at the empty canyon, at the harsh, beautiful landscape that was now their world. It was still full of challenges, full of consequences for the man beside her. But she was not alone, and neither was he. The quiet trust between them, forged in silence and shared danger, was a foundation stronger than any stone wall. It was a quiet partnership born of necessity and mutual respect. He had changed her life forever, giving her freedom and a glimpse of her own strength. And perhaps, in her unexpected presence, in the quiet care she could offer, she had changed his too, transforming his solitary existence into something slightly less empty, less alone. Their future was uncertain, marked by the consequences of his defiant act, but facing it together, however quietly, felt like a victory of its own, a testament to the enduring power of resilience and connection in a world determined to break them.